This talk today is about my 20-plus year relationship with a piece of music called Credo in Us by the experimental composer and philosopher John Cage. I use the word relationship because musicians often describe the process of learning music in rather intimate terms. We talk about living with music. We talk about getting it into our bodies. These are code phrases we use for practicing a lot, like tons of practicing. And we do this in order to bring the music to life for the audience. We can't really do it until we've got it memorized and thoroughly under our hands. John Cage had a great little phrase for this, one of his Zen-like aphorisms. A finished work is exactly that, requires resurrection. We're in the business of resurrecting old music, bringing it to life, revitalizing it. That's what performers do. Now, music historians do the same thing, except using slightly different means. We visit archives, we do research, and then we write our ideas. Both processes, for me, are really magical. They bring and they give voice to music that's been lost to the past. I've been fortunate to be involved with Credo in both capacities. My first time playing it, I performed it. I was engaging with it as a performer, memorizing, getting into it, and then years later, I began to study it, to get it into my body as a scholar. It's been a rocky road, this relationship. My first experience performing it was both the most exhilarating musical experience of my life and also the most humiliating. Now that's going to require some unpacking. I was born in Sitka, Alaska. I sang in the choir. I played drums in the band. I was primarily self-taught. This was before the internet, way, way back when, and I learned about other musics through TV. The Lawrence Welk show at my grandmother's house, for example. The radio, often what was playing on Raven Radio, and through my parents' and my friends' record collections. That was it. I went to Oberlin, where I met musicians from all over the world, experienced amazing streams of music from all different cultures, and I was overwhelmed. I felt naive. I knew I was naive. I felt ignorant. But like most Alaskans, we make up for it in our curiosity. I was hungry to know more. Early in my first year, I was given a piece of music to perform. It was called Credo in Us by John Cage. I'd never heard of John Cage. I had no idea. It was for percussion and piano. Now, what I had to find and collect to play this piece was tin cans. We needed 10 tin cans, like the industrial-sized tin cans you use to pack Del Monte peaches for dining halls. We needed an office buzzer. We needed a Native American tom-tom. We needed a pianist that was willing to play inside the piano to mute the strings. And then we also needed an old radio, the kind that you twist the dial to tune between stations, and we needed a turntable. Now, I know what you're thinking. No way, right? You had to go to a junkyard to get your instruments? The dining hall dumpster? Yeah, we did. We would be tuning these tin cans carefully. We needed to have a whole pitch range, and we did it with great care. This blew my mind, right? I remember the pianist had to play all these cowboy song and a blues and whatnot, and we had to play all these groovy rhythms, and I just remember being completely overwhelmed, especially the first spring evening in 1989 when we performed it. The opening was particularly shocking. So imagine this Alaskan boy put into that musical situation, right? Whoa, mind-blowing. Tin cans, radio sounds, cowboy tunes, boogie-woogies, blues. it just changed my conception of what music could be. It was a collage of everyday sounds mixed with classical recordings, mixed with used car commercials on the radio. It completely blew my mind. I had to rethink what music was. Suddenly, noise could be music, and music could be noise. Noise could be music. It was a paradigm shift for me, and I felt it was more explosive, more profound because I had a culture shock of moving from Alaska onto Oberlin. I was digging it, though. I was really into it. I felt deeply that I'd met my tribe. I'd found my peoples. My peoples were the avant-gardists, and that's where I wanted to be. So imagine in our first performance, we're all grooving together. The tin can players, the dude doing the piano stuff, and the record player operator. And it feels like we're experiencing a new style of jazz. So in that first performance, I'm having this flow experience. I've lost track of time. The players were grooving, we're bopping our head. And when the records come on and the radio plays and the pianist plays really loud and we play all these rhythms, the audience begins to cheer. Now, this never happens at new music concerts, for sure. The audience usually listens carefully and want to pick up everything. But they're clapping and cheering us on. I'm like, I'm getting the rock star groove, right? And I'm moving, and then soon I get to bounce, right? I always bounced when I played in Alaska. People loved it. They would say, hey, you bounce when you play. It's really cool. And sometimes you open your mouth and your tongue sticks out. That's really cool. So I'm going, we're about to get to the climax of the piece, and I feel a hand on my shoulder. My teacher has come around behind me and whispers in my ear, stop moving. Stop bouncing. And all at once, I go from this incredible high to shame and humiliation because I felt that everybody in the audience heard his words and I had just made a major faux pas, right? Alaskan boy goes, makes big mistake. Flash forward a few years and I'm sitting in my dissertation advisor's office and she says, now when picking a dissertation topic, you should think about something with which you have an emotional attachment. Boom, Credo and Us pops into my head. And I start describing the scene. There's this performance and this thing happened, it was really exhilarating. And she said, that's what you should write about. And I thought, really? You want me to write a dissertation about one piece? Well, I started to think about the emotional experience and also the questions we had when we first performed the piece. What does the title mean, Credo and Us? Credo, taken from the Roman Catholic Mass, I believe. It means I believe. In us, or US, is it us, the collective us, that we believe in, or US, the United States? Turns out that Cage meant both. Also, Credo was composed for a dance. Boy, did I feel vindicated. Yes! You're supposed to move in this piece. Of course, you're supposed to move. But this was not just any dance. This was the first choreographed work by Merce Cunningham and his partner, Gene Erdman. It was his first collaboration with Cage. Not only was it a dance, it was also a dance drama, which meant that it had a script. Nobody had found the script, but I found it in a library in New York. It was a very poetic script. And there was a whole scenario that went with it. It was about a husband and wife that didn't like each other at all. It's a whole critique, satire, of middle-class life. It was set in the West. It was for two people, a husband and wife. Each had two names. The husband was called Shadow. The wife was called Ghoul's Rage. So here you see wife getting ready to drop-kick husband. Husband is Shadow for a reason. He's never around. He doesn't like to touch his wife. Here you could see her suspended from his neck. He's not even going to support her. And of course, in her scene, she goes crazy. She does this dance of death where she runs around the stage really fast and then collapses in the middle. So it's a pretty bleak portrayal of marriage. And I started to ask questions, what was Cage's marriage like? because I'd heard somewhere that he was married. Now, we have to keep in mind that after this performance, Cage and Cunningham become a couple. They become a lifelong couple, which they kept secret for a long time. So we often don't talk about Cage's wife. So as part of my dissertation, I began to explore her life as well. It turns out Xenia Kashavarov had grown up in southeast Alaska, between Juneau and Sitka. Her father was Father Andrew Kashavarov. He was a Russian Orthodox priest and teacher who once served at St. Michael's here in Sitka. So there were these connections suddenly that I was discovering. Oh my gosh, I can't get away from my hometown. Here I go, I'm doing all this research. And St. Michael's, of course I know St. Michael's. And so I began to dig into her life a little bit, and I found out that after growing up in southeast Alaska, she moved to California when she was a teenager, and she lived in Pacific Grove with her aunt, with her sister Sasha, and her uncle Jack Calvin. And while she was there, she met John Steinbeck. She was photographed by Edward Weston, and she met the philosopher of Cannery Row, Ed Ricketts, who's a marine biologist we've been hearing a lot about. So I wondered about that life, and I started to explore these relationships, this network of relationships. And it turned out that Credo and Us, the friendship that nurtured this piece, began here in Sitka in 1932, actually here in Thimbleberry Bay. I'm pretty sure everybody knows where that is. One morning, 1932, Xenia was sunbathing on a rock, perhaps even this rock, and a man who was out swimming climbed up on the rock next to her. She was very surprised. She thought it was a seal at first, but it turned out to be Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell, we all know, is a very famous mythologist, author of Hero of a Thousand Faces, which came out years later. But at this time in Alaska, he was just a dude out on an adventure looking for the meaning of life. He just graduated from Columbia, and he had befriended Jack Calvin and Ed Ricketts and had come up on their 1932 expedition to collect marine animals. And so they became friends. They visited for a couple weeks, looked at totem poles in Totem Park, went to St. Michael's, and they cemented this lifelong relationship. Now, fast forward 10 years, Xenia marries Cage, and they're trying to figure out their lives as artists. Xenia is a very accomplished artist at this time, and Cage is trying to make his way as a composer. They move into Peggy Guggenheim's home in New York City, and they become part of this huge network of artists in exile, including Peggy Guggenheim's husband, Max Ernst, great surrealist painter, Marcel Duchamp, Piet Mondrian, among others. They threw massive parties, really exciting parties, and everybody came, including the stripper Gypsy Rose Lee, and it was very exciting. But soon there was a scandal, and the Cages were kicked out of Guggenheim's house. Where did they go? They were homeless in New York City at the start of World War II. It was all dark, all the lights were shut off because they thought the Nazis were going to come bomb at any moment. Joseph Campbell offered them the use of his Greenwich Village apartment. And he said, you can borrow my apartment. I know you don't have any money. In exchange for rent, I'd like you to write a piece of music for me, John Cage. It's going to be for my wife, Jean Erdman, and her friend, Merce Cunningham. They were in the Martha Graham Company at the time. And Cage said, okay. So he spent a couple months there writing this piece of music, which became Credo and Us. Rock in Thimbleberry Bay, apartment in Greenwich Village, connection, a new piece of music. Imagine my surprise. I had no idea that was going to happen. So studying this web of personal relationships became the focus of my dissertation. Tracing friendships and stories and narratives became almost more fascinating than the actual music. And I began to see the world differently. I thought, if I can look at this little 15-minute piece of music, this quirky piece of music, and it can tell all of these stories, what other small things that we often overlook in this world contain magnitudes, to channel Whitman, right? Everything. We could do a dissertation about this clicker that doesn't even really work very well, or this wrapper for this cough drop, right? Every little thing has probably this deep well of history and personal relationships. So I became very fascinated by that. In 2011, after I finished my dissertation, I found out my father had cancer. And I came home to be with him near the end, and I was racked with guilt because during my dissertation, I had lost track of everything. I lost track of my family back here, my friends back here in Alaska. You know, it's kind of an immersive experience. And suddenly I came out of this experience, I was confronted with mortality. And I felt really guilty, and I felt really sad. And when I was with him at the end, I apologized for letting our relationship go near the end. And he took a short, deep breath, or a short breath. He had lung cancer, so he took a little breath and he said, "It's all good." And I felt better. While I was here that summer, my relationship with Credo changed in another way. I met people who knew Xenia Kashivarov. I met Nancy Ricketts again, Ed Ricketts' daughter, and she talked about meeting Xenia on Cannery Row when she was a young girl. I met the Kashivarov family historian, Mary Purvis, who showed me pictures and letters. All this deepened my relationship until I began to internalize the people in the narrative. I began to dream about them and daydream about them, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is telling me something. These stories are so wonderful. I began to imagine the meeting in Thimbleberry Bay, the grand parties in New York in 1942. So I've decided to put them into a fictional format. I've decided to work on a novel, and I'm calling it The New Bohemians. And so I'm in the midst of this, and I'm surprised as anyone. I never expected that I would be writing a novel about these people. And that brings me to the last bit. When I came back to Sitka in 2011, I rediscovered a network of my own friends and family here in Sitka, and their efforts on this campus to take back what people thought of was something seemingly insignificant, a college campus with historic buildings. At one point, this place was all boarded up, and people drove past and tried to ignore it. And then folks started to get together and volunteer, and I felt I needed to be part of that process. I felt, after studying a network of friends and lovers and family, that I needed to rejoin a network of folks working on something profoundly meaningful. And so, in a sense, I feel like I've come home, and in a profound way, I feel like this piece has some way mystically brought me home. Thank you very much.